There is a quiet experiment that begins the moment a person decides, even briefly, to eat clean for 7 days. It does not announce itself loudly, nor does it transform the body overnight in dramatic, cinematic ways. Instead, it unfolds beneath the surface, in layers of biology and behavior, like a conversation between your choices and your cells. To understand what happens during these 7 days, we must slow down and observe the body not as a machine that reacts instantly, but as a living system that adapts, recalibrates, and remembers. On the first day, the change is more psychological than physiological. The body is still running on yesterday's habits. Glucose levels fluctuate according to previous patterns, insulin still responds to familiar spikes, and the digestive system continues its routine. But something subtle shifts. When processed sugars and ultra-refined carbohydrates are removed, the brain notices their absence. Not because it needs them in a biological sense, but because it has grown accustomed to their predictability. The reward pathways, particularly those linked to dopamine signaling, begin to react. Cravings emerge, not as hunger, but as a kind of memory. This is the first lesson. Much of what we call hunger is not about energy deficit, but about expectation. By the second day, the metabolic system begins to adjust its rhythm. Without frequent surges of simple sugars, blood glucose stabilizes. Insulin secretion becomes less erratic. This stability is not dramatic enough to feel like a transformation, but it is foundational. The body begins to move away from rapid energy spikes and crashes toward a more sustained release of fuel. Glycogen stores in the liver are still sufficient, but the body becomes slightly more efficient at accessing them. You may notice moments of irritability or fatigue, and these are often misinterpreted as weakness. In reality, they are signs of transition. The body is recalibrating its energy economy. By the third day, something deeper begins to occur in the gut. The microbiome, that vast ecosystem of trillions of microorganisms, responds quickly to dietary change. When clean eating introduces more fiber, phytonutrients, and unprocessed foods, beneficial bacteria begin to flourish. At the same time, those that thrive on processed sugars and additives begin to lose their dominance. This shift is not merely about digestion. It influences inflammation, immune signaling, and even mood. There is a growing body of evidence suggesting that the gut and brain communicate continuously through the gut-brain axis. As the microbial balance begins to change, some people experience subtle improvements in mental clarity, while others may feel temporary discomfort. This is not a malfunction, but a reorganization. By the fourth day, the liver becomes a central player in this unfolding story. Freed from the constant burden of processing excess sugars, artificial additives, and unhealthy fats, it begins to operate more efficiently. Detoxification pathways, which are always active, now function with less interference. It is important to understand that the body is always detoxifying. Clean eating does not activate detox, but it reduces the load. This distinction matters, because it shifts the narrative from magical thinking to physiological reality. The liver, kidneys, and digestive system work continuously, and what changes is the environment in which they operate. Around this time, hydration status often improves as well. Clean eating tends to involve foods with higher water content, such as fruits and vegetables, and a reduction in sodium-heavy processed foods. As a result, the body begins to regulate fluid balance more effectively. You may notice reduced bloating, not because fat has been lost, but because excess water retention decreases. This can create a feeling of lightness, a subtle but meaningful shift in how the body is experienced from within. By the fifth day, energy levels often begin to stabilize in a noticeable way. This is the point at which many people report feeling different, though they may struggle to articulate exactly how. The absence of rapid blood sugar fluctuations allows for a more consistent supply of energy to the brain and muscles. Mitochondria, the energy-producing structures within cells, operate more efficiently when they are not constantly responding to metabolic stress. This efficiency does not produce a sudden burst of energy, but rather a steady, reliable flow. It is the difference between a flickering light and a steady flame. Sleep patterns may also begin to shift. Clean eating often reduces the intake of stimulants, excess sugar, and heavy late-night meals, all of which can disrupt circadian rhythms. As the body's internal clock begins to realign, sleep may become deeper and more restorative. This, in turn, influences hormone regulation. Cortisol, the stress hormone, may begin to follow a more natural rhythm, rising in the morning and falling at night. Melatonin production becomes more consistent, supporting better sleep quality. These changes are subtle, but they ripple outward, affecting mood, cognition, and overall well-being. By the 6th day, inflammation markers in the body may begin to decrease. Chronic low-grade inflammation is often driven by poor dietary patterns, including excessive sugar, trans fats, and processed foods. When these are removed, the immune system can operate with greater precision rather than constant activation. This does not mean that inflammation disappears, as it is a necessary part of immune function, but it becomes more regulated. Some people notice reduced joint discomfort, clearer skin, or a general sense of ease in the body. These are not miracles. They are the natural consequence of reduced physiological stress. At this stage, the relationship with food itself begins to change. Clean eating for several days creates a form of sensory recalibration. Taste buds, which are highly adaptable, become more sensitive to natural flavors. Foods that once seemed bland may now reveal complexity. Sweetness in fruits becomes more pronounced, while overly processed foods may begin to taste excessively intense. This shift is not merely about preference. It reflects changes in neural processing and sensory perception. The body begins to recognize and respond to nourishment in a more direct way. By the 7th day, the experiment reaches a kind of quiet equilibrium. The body is not transformed into a completely different entity, but it has moved into a state of improved coherence. Systems that were previously operating under strain begin to align. Blood sugar regulation is more stable, digestion is more efficient, inflammation is reduced, and energy is more consistent. But perhaps the most significant change is not purely physical. It is perceptual. There is a growing awareness of how food influences not just the body, but the experience of being in that body. This awareness is both empowering and humbling. It reveals that health is not a fixed state, but a dynamic process shaped by daily choices. It also challenges the idea that change must be extreme or immediate to be meaningful. 7 days is a short period in the timeline of a human life, and yet it is long enough to initiate a cascade of biological adjustments. What makes this process fascinating from a scientific perspective is its complexity. There is no single pathway or mechanism that explains the changes observed during clean eating. Instead, it is the interplay of multiple systems: metabolic, neurological, immunological, and psychological. Each system responds in its own way, but they are deeply interconnected. A change in one area influences the others, creating a network of adaptations. For example, improved blood sugar stability influences brain function, which in turn affects mood and decision-making. A healthier gut microbiome influences immune responses and neurotransmitter production. Reduced inflammation supports better cellular function across multiple systems. These interactions are not linear. They are dynamic and often unpredictable. This is why individual experiences of clean eating can vary, even when the underlying principles are the same. There is also a philosophical dimension to this process. Clean eating, at its core, is an act of attention. It requires a person to become more aware of what they consume, how it is prepared, and how it affects them. This attention creates a feedback loop. The more aware you become, the more you notice subtle changes. The more you notice, the more intentional your choices become. This loop is not driven by external rules, but by internal observation. It is important to recognize that 7 days is not a final destination. The body does not reach a state of perfect health in such a short time, nor does it erase the effects of previous habits. What it does is demonstrate the body's capacity to adapt and respond. It shows that even small, consistent changes can initiate meaningful biological shifts. This understanding can be more powerful than any specific dietary guideline because it emphasizes process over perfection. In the end, what happens when you start eating clean for 7 days is not a single event, but a series of interconnected changes that unfold over time. It is a dialogue between behavior and biology, between intention and adaptation. It is a reminder that the body is not passive, but actively engaged in responding to the environment you create for it. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals that health is not something you achieve once and hold on to, but something you participate in, moment by moment, choice by choice, in ways that are both deeply scientific and quietly profound.